Well, the budget delay continues. Conversations on key topics still dragging on. How soon we could see that final budget in place? We're going to break it down for you. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. Another week has passed, and the state still doesn't have that budget finalized. Legislators passing that extender, extending the deadline out to tomorrow, Monday, April 10th, to allow negotiations to continue. Lawmakers expected to return to Albany after this Easter weekend. Several important items still being discussed for the final budget, and they are the governor's proposal to index the minimum wage to inflation, a housing push to build over 800,000 new homes in the next decade, and of course the biggest item still those proposed changes to bail reform. So far, only 1 out of 10 budget bills have been passed.
Bail is now taking up pretty much all the oxygen in the room, and everything else is second. I mean, conversations are still being had, but that's, I'd say it was bail and housing was 90%. Bail itself now maybe 90%.
And joining us now to give us some additional insight into where the state budget stands, State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli. Thanks so much for coming in. Nice to see you.
Ryan, good to see you.
Your favorite time of year?
My favorite time of year. Well, let's say it's one of the more stressful times of year.
I'm sure. I have a copy of a letter here dated yesterday that you sent to the governor. Now, one extender has already been passed, correct?
Correct.
That pushed the deadline off to the 10th, which is Monday.
Right.
And if we don't have a deal in place still by then, what needs to happen here?
Well, they need to do another extender because we have another payroll coming. So we have, not to get too technical, but there are 2 different payrolls that we're responsible for. So that's where the stress comes for us, because the stress is there if our state workers think they're not going to get paid because the budget's late. So the tradition has been, if the budget agreement is not in place, they do an extender for a period of time to make sure that the employees can get paid, and therefore the services continue. So you're right, the first extender will expire on Monday, but they need to do another extender because another payroll comes due.
That's right.
So Monday becomes a very key day for the next payroll. It's called the administration payroll. It's even a larger payroll than the institution payroll that we did the week before. Look, the bottom line, Ryan, is they need to get the budget done. We don't want to fall into this bad habit of every week having to do another extender. It creates a lot of tension with the state workforce. Not having a budget in place also creates a lot of uncertainty out there for our local governments, particularly our school districts. Pretty soon we're going to have school budget votes coming up.
Right.
School districts want to know what kind of state aid they're getting. They'd like to know the real numbers. So, you know, I know everybody's taking a break with Easter Passover holiday. Probably no surprise there. But leaders are still talking, so discussions are going on. When they come back on Monday, hopefully, number one, if they don't have agreement, at least do the extender right away, remove that uncertainty, and really try to hammer out an agreement and start voting on budget bills.
And large payrolls that need to be met, but these lawmakers, the legislators themselves, will not get paid.
Well, that's a good point.
Until this gets passed.
I'm glad you mentioned that. So under state law, if a budget is not in place, legislative salaries are held up. So you're absolutely right. So the extender does not change the fact that legislators will not receive their paycheck until a budget is in place.
From what you've seen so far, as you pay attention to these negotiations as well and what you've seen proposed, is there anything that's alarming or stands out to you that you think needs to be addressed as they move forward?
Let me say a couple things. First of all, as controller, you know, I don't have, you know, under the Constitution, a direct role, you know, in the negotiations or deciding how much money is being spent where. That's for the legislature and the governor. What overall we have expressed concern about, and then when they put the budget in place, we'll do our detailed analysis, is really the question of the out-year budget gaps that seem to be emerging again. And you obviously have a number of, let's call it non-money or non-budget items that are holding up the agreement. You know, discussion about bail reform, you know, charter schools, you know, the housing compact proposal, and any number of other issues. So the concern I have is that when they break the logjam on those, in effect, policy questions that frankly could be handled outside of a budget discussion, Are they going to have the time to really analyze how much are we spending? Is it an appropriate level? What are the implications for spending choices today, for next year, for 4 or 5 years down the road? And that's where I think the budget process is not served well, when so much time and energy is spent on in effect, non-money, non-budget issues at the expense of really looking at what makes sense for the budget. So our concern is the out-year budget gaps. Our concern is continued reliance on too much debt in New York State. So we want to see what kind of final decisions are being made to deal with some of those questions. But look, there are some very contentious issues out there. But timeliness is important. We have to send the message not only to New York residents, but to the financial community, to local governments, that New York is still doing its business.
And you often talk a lot, too, about transparency, about budget transparency. So do a lot of outside government watchdog groups. And it seems, at least to me and a lot of other people, it seems negotiations seem to start in good faith. That transparency seems to be there. But in the end run, it kind of fades away, if you will, right?
Well, in the old days, you remember I was in the legislature for 2 decades, so you just took about 3 men in a room.
Yeah.
So it's not 3 men anymore, which is maybe a good thing. So it's one guy and 2 women. But very often I can tell you when I was a member, and I think there's some of that going on now, even the rank and file members aren't sure, what all the details are. Technically, we do have a conference committee process where rank and file members are engaged in the process. We don't really utilize that as robustly as I think it was first intended. So when members are somewhat left out of direct discussions, the press certainly is left out to a large extent. So that means the public is left out. And I've always said, when we're making some tough choices about spending, about revenue, about taxes, policy choices, isn't it better to have folks know what the options are that are being considered? Then they can give thoughtful input to their elected officials. So, as always, the process, I think, would benefit from more transparency, more openness. That's really how you get accountability. But, some of this, for better or for worse, is just how state government has functioned for a long time.
You've written about recently, too, some proposed changes to eliminate competitive bidding requirements. What is the concern there? We made a lot of progress at the end of last year with the commitment of the governor to really get back to more openness and accountability in terms of the Comptroller's Office contract review, in terms of not doing big carve-outs to go around competitive bidding. Unfortunately, in the executive budget proposal, and as you point out, some of the watchdog groups have really raised this, and I appreciate that, we've seen not a big step, but a small step backward on some of that front. So taking away some of our contract pre-audit, we call it contract review authority, and circumventing competitive bidding in a small, relatively small category, but still, I think it's a bad precedent to go backwards. Why competitive bidding? You're more likely going to get best value in terms of taxpayer dollars. Open competition means you have more integrity in the process. Obviously, over a number of years now, there have been a lot of questions raised when you have a more closed procurement process. Right. So sunlight that comes with competitive bidding makes more sense from my point of view. All right, Monday the 10th coming up awfully quick here after this big holiday weekend.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens. State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli, nice to see you in person here.
Thank you, Ryan.
It's
great to be in your studio.
Thank you very much.
Look forward to coming back.
Excellent. We'll see you soon. All right, a series of fake threats causing concern at schools across the state. When we return, we'll hear from the Rural Schools Association on how they're handling those threats, how they'd like to see the state respond. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. Schools around the state facing a series of those hoax, phony, active shooter threat calls this week, those so-called swatting calls, causing a great deal of concern, stress, and trauma for students, parents, school staff all over the state. Now lawmakers are pushing to increase the punishment for those responsible for these swatting calls. Currently, it's considered falsely reporting an incident in the 3rd degree, which carries only misdemeanor penalties. The new legislation would increase that to falsely reporting an incident in the 2nd degree, a felony punishable by up to 4 years in prison. Joining us now is David Allen Little, Executive Director of the Rural Schools Association here in New York, giving us a little bit more insight into those swatting threats the schools have faced recently, and of course, budget time now. David, thanks for coming in.
My pleasure,
Nice to
Ryan,
see you here in
thanks.
person.
Yeah, it is.
So
It is.
let's talk about these incidents. First off here, these phony phone calls, these calls of fake active shooter threats, bomb threats. We saw a rash of them over the past week or so, unfortunately, following the latest mass shooting there in Nashville. What have you heard from your districts, your school leaders? How much of an impact, especially on the mental health of our kids, is this? I mean, it's got to be horrible.
It's a massive traumatic impact. The best way I can describe this is to give you an example. When Plattsburgh got their call, I just talked to the BOCES superintendent on my way here this morning. He told me when Plattsburgh got the call came to law enforcement. The first that students in the school knew about what was happening was when they were literally faced with armed law enforcement with guns drawn, coming around a corner and coming face to face. And the emotional trauma of seeing an officer ready to shoot you, right? The repeated nature of this is it's phenomenally traumatic. It's dangerous. Law enforcement speeding to the scene of these multiple areas. Again, at Plattsburgh, they had everybody from Customs and Border Patrol, local sheriffs, state police, NCON officers. Anybody who was in law enforcement was there, upwards of 75 officers, because in an active shooter situation, we know from Parkland, you've got less than 5 minutes.
Right.
And a shot every 2 seconds, right? So they need to be in there as quickly as possible. The impact of a wave of bomb threats that happened almost immediately, 3 days after the wave of active shooter threats, is not only just disruptive to public education, but this is our generation's duck and cover drills. Right. You know, I mean, I grew up with getting under your desk thinking that would somehow save you from an atomic blast, right? And now children are coming to school wondering whether they're going to survive the day. And to think that that doesn't have an impact on them is very naive.
And it's hard to, you know, I have 3 kids in 5th, 3rd, and 2nd grade. And knowing that they're growing up and going to school with yearly active shooter training drills, it's hard. And I can't imagine what their little minds are thinking. And we've talked about it with our kids. As hard as it is sometimes, in the business I'm in, I tend to want to watch the news at home, and sometimes I don't, because I feel like I shouldn't be exposing them to all of that, but at the same time I know we need to talk about it. And it brings up things sometimes, that sparks things in them that maybe they haven't felt like talking about yet and are more comfortable to talk about, and unfortunately these are the things we need to talk about.
Yeah, from an emotional standpoint, again, the trauma, the potential that they would eventually become desensitized. I mean, if these things are coming in waves day after day, at some point, you know, does your vigilance lapse and you think it's just another hoax? There's the possibility that somebody, if you were going to plan this kind of heinous attack, perhaps the first thing you would do would be to call in a fake threat someplace else and have those 75 officers swarm to someplace else, right, so that you're free.
Certainly a real concern, yeah.
It's phenomenally devastating and a significant challenge, both for law enforcement and for technology, to try and figure this out. You know, the information that this came from Western Europe means that we need international law enforcement and we need technology help. This isn't a 15-year-old kid who doesn't want to go to school on a Thursday. It's beyond that now.
And we know, and we're now seeing action, of course, immediately from the federal level with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer recently announcing, you know, increasing the penalties for actions like this and getting the money behind it in a bipartisan effort, which was nice to hear. Speaking of money and budgeting, we are in the budget process here in New York State. We are delayed 6 days past due of us sitting down and talking here, extended out to Monday the 10th, and as it looks right now, maybe extending that even farther. What concerns does that have for school districts around the state, and especially for our smaller, more rural districts that you deal with on a regular basis?
It's always a concern when the budget is late. Now being officially older than dirt, I've been either part of the legislative process or working with our state leaders now for, this is my literally 40th year in this. So I've been through the years when the budget was months late.
Yeah.
You know, and it had a significant impact when you don't know how much money you're going to be operating on moving forward. Very tight timeline for school districts because they have their own local budgets based on those projections and what they think they're going to get. If that were to change, that would obviously be extremely disruptive to them. But fortunately for this year, I mean, everything that I've been led to believe is that education is not the sticking point for once, and that the amount to be given has been settled for some time now. And so although that system has really caused some economic hardship to many small districts that are what they call save harmless. They've been fully funded under the formula for some time. They're getting half of the inflationary rate. And so the money that they're being provided is not sufficient. It's just an anomaly of the last year of fully funding everybody. We're seeing many of our wealthiest districts finally getting their money. So you have this strange reverse Robin Hood anomaly where our poorest districts are struggling the worst, and our very wealthiest districts that rely on the state very little because of the wealth within their own district, they're getting double-digit increases.
Oh, the last time you and I spoke, we had learned that the foundation aid was proposed finally going to be fully funded in the state budget really for the first time ever here. So that was great news.
It is great news. It's also well over a decade since anybody took a look at what's in the formula. So I'm thrilled not only that they finally fulfilled their promise, but that once it's done, it begs the question, what now? Because when this was created, this formula was created, what Bob Lowry from Superintendents calls an underappreciated legislative achievement. Tremendous effort at the time. We're now well into other things that need to be recognized in the formula. Mental health is not in the formula. Student need is inaccurately reported because we're using 20-year-old information. And there have been tremendous demographic shifts within our state in that time period. We need to figure this out quickly because once again, we're fully funding what we're supposed to, but what we're supposed to fund is not accurately reflecting student need anymore.
David Allen Little, Rural Schools Association of New York. Nice to see you in person.
Same here, Frank.
Thanks for coming in, David. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right, as the state budget continues to see debate, one plan is seeing pushback from lawmakers. When we return, we'll have reaction from both sides of the aisle on tying minimum wage increases to inflation. And remember, you got a comment, story idea, please let us know. You can always email EmpireStateWeekly@gmail.com or seek us out on Twitter. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Ryan Peterson here in Albany. As inflation goes up, the minimum wage should go up as well. That's one of Governor Hochul's big budget proposals. Our Capitol correspondent Jamie DeLine has reaction on that from both sides of the aisle.
Governor Kathy Hochul wants to peg minimum wage to inflation. This proposal is something AFL-CIO, a federation of unions, supports.
The reality is that we know that over time the cost of living increases, so purchasing power decreases, and as a result, from year to year, minimum wage earners find it much more difficult to support themselves and their families.
Mario Salento, president of the union movement in New York State, says this could be beneficial to all New Yorkers, not just those who make minimum wage.
When we have a stimulated economy like this, and we have the lowest wage earners contributing to our economy, it allows us to have more tax dollars to pay for healthcare, education, transportation, sanitation. So really all 20 million New Yorkers can benefit by raising the minimum wage and indexing it.
But not everyone is totally on board.
You have a problem with that because the consumer price index goes up as inflation rises. And if you pegged increase in minimum wage to that, wages would go up. That would cause inflation. And then as inflation goes up, that would cause the minimum wage goes up. But as inflation rises, unfortunately, that lessens the value of the dollar. So it would decrease the value of any increase in the minimum wage. So ultimately, we think a better way of indexing, if you want to index it to somebody, it should be to personal income, which doesn't rise necessarily as inflation increases.
As budget negotiations continue, it's unclear at this point what exactly will be included in the final state budget.
I know that everyone's talking about it. We've had conversations with the governor, with both leaders of both houses, and talks are progressing.
Reporting in Albany, I'm Jamie DeLine.
All right, stick around. We'll be right back with a look at the week ahead in just a moment. And as always, if you've got a comment, story idea, we would love to hear from you. Email EmpireStateWeekly@gmail.com or find us on Twitter. And finally, from us here on Empire State Weekly, we are keeping an eye on the coming week as the budget is coming due. They have extended the deadline now to Monday the 10th. Same day negotiations are supposed to resume though, however, right? We'll continue to bring you the latest following any new deadline that is put into place, any additional extenders and developments that may come out of all this. You know where to look. From all of us here on Empire State Weekly, I'm Ryan Peterson in Albany. We'll see you right back here next week, maybe with a budget. Don't forget, you can watch Empire State Weekly all over the state of New York. Here's a full list of all the stations and where you can see us on 10 TV stations across New York.